Well, I mean, history usually tells us that empires are built with the chisel and the sword, right?
Absolutely.
Like, we're completely conditioned to think of the ancient world in these incredibly loud binary terms. You either have this massive army and you carve your name into a mountain to ensure history remembers you,
Right.
or you're the one being conquered.
Hmm.
And we look at the giant statues, the sweeping narratives of hard power, and we just assume that the guy holding the spear is the one who actually built the system.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very seductive way to view history, mostly because monuments and battlefields are just highly visible, like they leave these massive, unmistakable footprints.
For sure.
But it completely ignores the structural reality of how human civilization actually functions over time.
Right.
Like, a man with a sword can conquer a city, sure, but a sword cannot harvest grain.
Exactly.
It can't manage the supply chain. And it certainly cannot invent the constitutional frameworks required to keep an empire from fracturing the moment the conqueror dies.
Which is exactly why we're turning our focus away from the monuments today. Because if you want to understand how the greatest superpower of the ancient world actually survived its own, like, really volatile creation, you have to look past the men carving stone.
You really do.
You have to look at the woman holding a clay stamp.
Yeah.
So we're taking a deep dive into Atossa, the shadow queen of the Achaemenid Empire. And our mission for you today is to deconstruct how a woman who was just systematically stripped of traditional hard power used logistics, economic autonomy, and sheer strategic intellect to act as the mortar holding the Persian Empire together.
Mortar is really the essential concept here, I think. We're
Yeah.
working from an incredibly robust synthesis of sources today, which is anchored by a presentation titled The Shadow Queen, How Atossa Architected the Achaemenid Golden Age.
Right.
And what makes this source material so compelling is that it forces us to reconcile vastly different types of historical evidence. I
Yeah.
mean, we have the high literary drama of Greek historians and playwrights like Herodotus and Aeschylus.
Gossips, basically.
Exactly. And then we have modern historiographical analysis, and most importantly, we have the Persepolis fortification tablets.
The receipts. Literally, the receipts.
Quite literally. I mean, we're talking about thousands of administrative clay receipts documenting the daily movement of resources in the ancient world. And when you cross-reference the poetry with the accounting, a radically different picture of power emerges.
It really does.
We see a woman who navigated a violently unstable era, not as a passive bystander in a royal court, but as its chief intellectual architect.
And to really grasp the scale of what she accomplished, I feel like we need to understand the absolute political whiplash of the era she lived in.
Oh yeah, the whiplash is intense.
Because the Achaemenid Empire didn't just smoothly grow, it was slammed together. Like, on one end of the timeline, you have her father, Cyrus the Great.
Right.
He's the archetypal conqueror. He built the borders with this rapid, brutal military expansion. But then on the other end of the timeline, you have the man she eventually marries, Darius I. And he's an entirely different kind of ruler.
Yeah, Darius is the administrator. He's the organizer. His reign is defined by, well, bureaucratic reform, taxation systems, and the construction of that monumental infrastructure you mentioned earlier.
But the transition between those two phases, right, moving from a society built for perpetual war to one built for administrative taxation, I mean, that has to be incredibly dangerous.
It is notoriously deadly.
Because when the conquering stops, you suddenly have this massive military class standing around looking for something to do, and a new bureaucratic class trying to tell them what to do.
Exactly. The chasm between a founding generation and a consolidating generation is the exact moment when most nascent empires tear themselves apart in civil war. And Atossa's fundamental identity, like the reason our sources describe her as the glue, is that she served as the human bridge across that chasm.
Because she was the daughter of Cyrus.
Right. She physically embodied the era of foundation.
But the sources go out of their way to emphasize that her value wasn't just political. It wasn't just, oh, her dad was the famous guy, so we should respect her. It was deeply theological, wasn't it?
Deeply, yeah.
Because if we look at her old Persian name, Kutafosa, it translates to the well-endowed or gifted. But it's also a direct echo of the legendary wife of King Vishtaspa in Zoroastrian tradition. So the people of the empire aren't looking at her as just a princess, they are looking at her as a literal religious icon.
And this requires us to really step into the ancient Persian worldview.
Yeah.
Because legitimacy to rule wasn't just a matter of military force or aristocratic lineage. It required divine mandate.
Right.
In the Zoroastrian theology of the time, this concept is called kavrena. We roughly translate it as divine royal blood or divine glory.
Yeah.
But to them, it was an almost tangible, mystical aura bestowed by the gods.
Like an actual glow.
Pretty much, it's the exclusive divine right to rule.
Mm-hmm.
And Atossa was universally recognized as the undisputed living vessel of the kavrena.
I want to pause on that for a second because that sounds like a terrifying position to be in.
It really is.
Like, if you are a woman in the 6th century BC and you physically embody the divine right to rule, but the patriarchal structure dictates that you cannot sit on the throne yourself. You know, you can only confer that power onto a man by marrying him. You aren't just a religious icon, you are the most dangerous political asset in the world.
She was the ultimate key to the kingdom. I mean, whoever controlled Atossa controlled the cosmological justification for the entire empire.
Wow.
So this incredible value placed on her bloodline necessitated what modern analysts call the containment strategy. The Achaemenid court had to build an impenetrable fortress around her. They didn't do it with walls, they did it with strict marital laws.
Right, the practice of exwadota, or close-kin marriage. And, okay, from a modern perspective, we look at sibling marriage and immediately recoil, obviously.
Naturally, yeah.
But functionally, if we strip away the modern sociological reactions, the logic of royal endogamy in this specific context was incredibly pragmatic. It basically rested on 3 pillars, right? Blood purity, throne security, and religious precedent.
Exactly. Let's examine the mechanics of those pillars. So blood purity isn't just about preserving a family look. It's about preventing the kavrena from diffusing into the broader nobility.
Okay, that makes sense.
Because if Atossa marries a powerful satrap or a wealthy noble, that noble's descendants suddenly possess a fragment of divine legitimacy. Give that a few generations, and you have a dozen rival factions who can all legally justify a civil war because they all have a drop of the divine glory.
It's pure risk management. Like, if you let the bloodline branch out, you're essentially printing too much currency and causing hyperinflation of your own divine legitimacy.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Which ties directly into throne security, I guess. Because if an outsider marries her, he doesn't just get access to wealth, he gains the immediate, undeniable right to overthrow whoever is currently sitting on the throne.
Right. And then the third pillar, religious precedent, served to justify all of this to the masses. By practicing close-kin marriage, the royal family deliberately mimicked the divine order of the Zoroastrian pantheon.
Oh, so they were saying we're like the gods.
Exactly. They were signaling to the populace, we are not subject to human morality. We operate on the level of the gods.
I'm trying to find a modern equivalent to understand the absolute lockdown of her life. If her blood is the ultimate corporate intellectual property, then this close-kin marriage system is essentially the world's most extreme non-compete clause.
That's exactly what it is.
They're locking the IP in a vault so no rival aristocrat can use her to launch a competing dynasty.
A corporate monopoly on divine right. And the Achaemenid kings were willing to go to extreme lengths to enforce that monopoly. Our sources point to this brilliant anecdote from Herodotus that perfectly illustrates the tension between these societal taboos and the desperation to secure Atossa.
I love this story.
Right. So when her father Cyrus died, her brother, Cambyses II, took the throne. And Cambyses realized he needed to marry Atossa to completely secure his position.
But even in a society that practices close-kin marriage to a degree, a full brother-sister marriage was apparently pushing the boundaries of what the Persian legal system was actually comfortable with.
It was highly irregular and deeply controversial among the nobility. So Cambyses couldn't just do it. He needed legal cover.
Right.
So he summoned the royal judges. These are the elite legal scholars whose entire job was to interpret the immutable laws of the empire. And he effectively demanded that they find a legal precedent for him to marry his sister.
Which puts the judges in an impossible position. I mean, you cannot tell the king of Persia that he's not allowed to do something, but you also can't just rewrite ancient religious law without losing your own authority.
Exactly.
So they execute this absolutely staggering piece of legal gymnastics. They hand down their ruling, and they tell Cambyses, we have searched the archives, and we have found no law allowing a brother to marry his sister.
Which is a very dangerous way to start a sentence when speaking to a volatile king.
Right. But then they add the pivot. They say, however, we did find a law that says the king of Persia may do whatever he pleases.
It is a masterful evasion. I mean, they preserve the integrity of the law regarding incest while simultaneously affirming the absolute, unassailable supremacy of the king. They gave him the exact loophole he needed.
It's politically brilliant, but it's also incredibly dark when you realize what it means for Atossa. Like, the legal system of the most powerful empire on Earth just bent over backward, simply to ensure she remained trapped within the family.
Yeah.
Her blood was so valuable that it thrust her into this terrifying decades-long survival drama.
And this is where we have to track the evolution of her strategic intellect. Because she doesn't just endure this containment, she learns from it. We can map her transformation by looking at the three vastly different men she was forced to marry.
Let's dive into that sequence. So we start with Cambyses II, her brother. This marriage lasts from roughly 530 to 522 BC. And strategically speaking, her role here is purely passive legitimation. She doesn't need to maneuver. She's just the physical anchor for her brother's claim.
And importantly, this marriage produced no offspring. It was a period of stagnation for her, but also observation.
How so?
Well, Cambyses was a notoriously erratic ruler who spent years away from the capital on these grueling military campaigns in Egypt. She watched how a kingdom functions or fails to function when the hard power is thousands of miles away fighting in the desert.
And then the hard power suddenly collapses. Cambyses dies under mysterious circumstances on his way back from Egypt. And the historical record is full of conflicting stories, right? Like an accidental sword wound to his own thigh, a severe infection, whispers of assassination.
Yeah, the sources are all over the place.
But the result is the same. The king is dead, the army is far from home, and the empire is immediately plunged into chaos. And into that power vacuum steps a man named Gaumata.
Known to history as Gaumata the usurper. He seizes the throne through deception and force. And think about the immediate logistical problem of a hostile takeover in the ancient world. You have no divine right, you have no legal claim. The nobility knows you are a fraud. How do you stop them from instantly tearing you apart?
You seize the corporate IP, you take Atossa.
Immediately. This second marriage, which lasted only about 7 months, represents the absolute nadir of her autonomy. In this phase, her strategic position is defined purely as the prize of conquest.
Wow.
Gaumata took control of the entire royal harem specifically to wield Atossa as a shield. He needed the nobility to look at the palace and see the vessel of the Varena sitting beside him.
I want to really dig into the psychological reality of those 7 months. Because it's so easy to read a historical timeline and just see, oh, marriage too, 7 months. But imagine being Atossa.
It's horrific.
Your brother is dead. A usurper has violently breached the palace. You are effectively a hostage, forced into a marriage with the man who stole your family's legacy. You're surrounded by guards loyal to him. Every single day you wake up knowing that if the Persian nobles decide to revolt against him, they will likely slaughter everyone in his inner circle just to be thorough.
The psychological resilience required to survive that environment is immense. I mean, she is completely stripped of agency, existing on a knife's edge between a paranoid usurper and a furious aristocracy. She is learning firsthand how fragile power based purely on deception and force truly is.
Which brings us to the most pivotal moment in her life. The aristocracy does revolt. A group of Persian nobles assassinates Gaumata, and the man who leads that assassination, the man who steps over the usurper's body to take the throne, is Darius I.
Right.
And just like the men before him, he knows exactly what he needs to do next. He marries Atossa.
But the power dynamic here is radically different. Darius was a nobleman, yes. He was a general from a collateral branch of the Achaemenid family. But he was fundamentally an outsider.
He wasn't in the direct line.
Exactly. He was not a direct descendant of Cyrus the Great. When he seized power, the empire instantly fractured. Massive rebellions erupted in Babylon, in Elam, in Media. His claim to the throne was incredibly tenuous.
He didn't just want her bloodline, he existentially needed it to survive the year.
Absolutely.
And this is where the historical narrative usually flattens women into trophies, you know? It's easy to look at Atossa being passed from Cambyses to Gaumata to Darius and assume she was just a passive victim of turbulent times. But this third marriage lasts for decades. She has 4 sons with Darius, and her role shifts dramatically. She evolves from the prize of conquest into the kingmaker.
Because she finally had leverage. She had watched a legitimate king die of overreach. She had watched a usurper die because he lacked foundational legitimacy. She understood the mechanics of Persian politics better than anyone alive. And she recognized that Darius, for all his military brilliance, was desperately vulnerable without her active cooperation.
Okay, so she has the leverage, but how does she actually use it? Like, it's one thing to be respected as the queen, it's another entirely to engineer the future of the empire.
Right.
And that brings us to the ultimate crisis of any monarchy succession. Because Darius had a massive problem. By the time he needed to name an heir, he had multiple wives and many sons. And there was a clear, legally sound frontrunner for the throne, and it wasn't Atossa's son.
No, the frontrunner was Artabazanes.
Yeah.
He was Darius's eldest son, born to the daughter of Gobryas, who was one of the most powerful and influential noblemen in the empire.
Okay.
Artabazanes had the law of primogeniture on his side. He was the firstborn. He had the backing of the entrenched military aristocracy. From a traditional standpoint, his succession was a foregone conclusion.
I'm struggling to understand how anyone overrides that. If the entire military aristocracy backs the eldest son and the law supports him, how does a woman with no armies essentially veto that decision?
It seems impossible.
Right. If Darius just ignores the law and picks a younger son, doesn't he trigger the exact civil war he's trying to avoid?
He absolutely would. And that is why Atossa didn't use emotional manipulation or palace intrigue. She didn't just beg Darius to favor her son, Xerxes. She engineered a constitutional philosophy that completely trapped the Persian court. Our sources refer to it as the Porter Genettos maneuver.
The born in the purple principle. Explain the exact logic of this, because it is a masterclass in legal maneuvering.
It really is. So Atossa observed the situation and identified a fatal structural flaw in Artabazanes' claim. She argued to Darius and the royal judges, yes, Artabazanes is technically your eldest son, but let us look at the timeline. When Artabazanes was born, what was your status, Darius? You were a private citizen. You were a nobleman, a general, but you were not the king.
Oh, that is sharp.
Therefore, she argued, Artabazanes is merely the firstborn son of Darius, the private citizen. But Xerxes, her own son, was born after Darius had assassinated Gaumata and ascended to absolute royal power.
Wow.
Xerxes was born in the purple born to a reigning monarch. Therefore, Xerxes is legally the firstborn son of Darius the king.
That is just, it's bulletproof.
Add to that the undeniable reality that Xerxes carried the direct, unadulterated blood of Cyrus the Great through Atossa, while Artabazanes did not.
So what does this mean for you, the listener, when you're trying to understand how power really works? It means Atossa recognized that you cannot fight entrenched military tradition with emotion. You have to fight it with a logic puzzle so airtight that opposing it sounds like treason.
Precisely.
She effectively invented a constitutional loophole out of thin air. She reframed a messy, dangerous harem dispute into a fundamental question of state theology.
She forced Darius's hand because no noble could argue against her logic without undermining the very nature of Darius's own kingship. If they argued that the timeline of Darius's ascent to power didn't matter, they were invalidating his reign.
Right, they'd be saying his kingship didn't mean anything.
Exactly. It was an inescapable legal trap that ensured her son became king without drawing a single sword.
It is brilliant. But let's be realistic here. Securing the legal right to the throne for your son is a massive victory, sure. But laws in the ancient world only matter if you can afford to pay the people enforcing them.
Very true.
To truly wield power, to be the architectural mortar of an empire, you need hard resources. You need logistics.
Yeah.
And this is where we have to completely change our perspective and look at the most surprising evidence in our sources today: the Persepolis fortification tablets.
This is where the historiography shifts from political theory to raw data. The Persepolis fortification tablets are an archive of tens of thousands of clay documents discovered in the ruins of Persepolis. They were written in Elamite script, and they date directly to the reign of Darius I.
And they're essentially an accounting system, right?
They are the granular, daily administrative records of the empire's core.
And what do these tablets actually record? Because we aren't talking about royal decrees or poetry here.
No, we are talking about grain allocations, wine distributions, meat rations, travel authorizations, and the management of agricultural workers. It is the mundane, vital accounting that keeps a civilization alive. And what shocked historians when these tablets were finally deciphered is that Atossa's name is everywhere.
The sources explicitly state that these tablets shatter the Western assumption that Eastern royal women were sequestered, invisible figures locked away in a harem. The tablets reveal Atossa as an economically autonomous, independent administrator. Let's look at the mechanisms of her power here. First, the independent seal.
Right, so in the Achaemenid bureaucratic system, you didn't sign your name with a pen. You rolled a carved cylinder seal across wet clay. That seal was your signature, your password, and your legal authority.
Okay.
The tablets proved that Atossa possessed her own personal seal, and she wielded it with absolute authority. She issued direct, legally binding orders to estate managers across Persia and Babylon without any secondary authorization from the king.
Think about that modern equivalent. We discussed the corporate IP analogy earlier. But with this seal, she's not just the first lady sitting in the boardroom. She is operating like a chief operating officer using a decentralized verification system.
That's a great way to think about it.
Like if we think of the Achaemenid bureaucracy almost like a modern blockchain ledger, where every movement of resources requires a verified, stamped node of approval, her seal was a master key.
That is exactly how it functioned. Her seal bypassed the standard bureaucratic hierarchy, which leads directly to her asset management. She wasn't just directing state funds, she had absolute control over her own vast agricultural estates. The tablets show her actively managing enormous stockpiles of agricultural wealth.
And she's using this wealth to fund her own initiatives. She has her own revenue streams. But the detail from the tablets that truly blew my mind is what the sources refer to as the mobile city. It's about her travel rations.
Oh, the scale is unbelievable.
Right.
When you look at the sheer volume of resources authorized for Atossa when she traveled, the numbers are staggering. We're talking about thousands of liters of wine, massive herds of sheep, tons of grain.
Because when she traveled from Persepolis to Susa or Babylon, she wasn't slipping quietly into a carriage with a few handmaidens.
Not at all. She was moving with the logistical footprint of a small city. She traveled with an entire retinue of administrators, guards, servants, and specialized workers. The tablets demonstrate that she was physically present and highly visible across the empire.
If you wanted to move thousands of people across the largest empire on Earth, she didn't have to petition Darius for funds. She just stamped a piece of dirt, and the international supply chain bent to her will.
It's incredible.
This fundamentally rewrites our understanding of female power in antiquity. Like, the men are out fighting wars, but Atossa is managing the supply lines. She's making sure the economy actually functions.
Her power was rooted in the dirt and the clay. It was unglamorous, but it was absolute. However, there is a profound friction in our sources.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
While the administrative tablets show us this invincible, autonomous logistical mastermind, the literary sources from the same era frame her in a completely different and deeply vulnerable light.
Yes, we have to pivot here from the reality of her economic power to the reality of her physical body, because Atossa holds a very specific, very sobering place in the history of medicine. According to our sources, she is widely considered to be the subject of the first written clinical history of breast cancer.
It is a stark reminder of the physical realities of the ancient world. The accounts, primarily transmitted through Herodotus, detail that Atossa suffered from a bleeding ulcer or a severe tumor on her breast. The German medical historiography cited in our sources refers to it as a Geschwulst, a swelling or growth.
And the most heartbreaking detail is her initial reaction. The sources say she hid it, she wrapped it in cloth, and suffered in absolute silence out of shame. Think about the isolation of that. You are the most powerful woman in the world, the living vessel of the divine, and you are secretly enduring this terrifying physical deterioration because you know your entire political value is intrinsically tied to your physical perfection.
The vulnerability is immense. But the way this medical crisis is resolved in the historical record is a perfect case study in how male historians manipulate the narratives of powerful women.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's examine the literary drama Herodotus constructs around this illness.
According to Herodotus, when she could no longer hide the tumor, she finally sought treatment from a captive Greek physician named Democedes. Democedes was essentially a highly skilled prisoner of war at the Persian court. And Herodotus claims that Democedes completely cured her of this malignant tumor.
Right.
But the cure came with a geopolitical price tag.
Herodotus writes that Democedes demanded a favor in exchange for saving her life. He allegedly forced Atossa to use pillow talk to manipulate Darius into launching scouting missions to Greece. The doctor's secret plan was that he would be assigned as a guide for these missions, which would give him the opportunity to escape back to his homeland.
Okay, I have to stop right here and aggressively push back on this entire narrative.
Oh.
Why is it that whenever a woman wields monumental, demonstrable power in history, male historians immediately reduce it to pillow talk?
It's a classic trope.
We literally just spent the last 20 minutes looking at actual physical receipts, proving she commanded international supply chains, managed vast estates, and moved small cities with a wave of her hand. But when Herodotus needs to explain how she influenced foreign policy, he ignores her massive administrative apparatus and claims she just whispered in her husband's ear in bed to pay off a medical debt.
It is deeply revealing of Greek cultural anxieties. You have to remember who Herodotus was writing for. The Greeks were terrified of the Persian Empire. Their own society was fiercely patriarchal, so the idea of a woman wielding tangible bureaucratic state power was incomprehensible to them. So when they looked at Atossa's undeniable influence over the Persian court, they had to rationalize it using the only framework they understood: female manipulation, secrecy, and sexuality.
They exoticized her power to make it less threatening. But what about the medical reality? If we strip away Herodotus's geopolitical drama, what is the actual diagnostic reality of a Greek doctor curing breast cancer in 500 BC?
Well, medical historians place a massive caveat on this story. The brutal truth is that malignant breast cancer was essentially incurable in the ancient world. If it was a truly malignant tumor that had ulcerated to the point of bleeding, no ancient Greek medical technique could have completely eradicated it and restored her to full health.
So if it wasn't cancer, what was it?
The modern diagnostic consensus suggests it was much more likely a severe localized infection, such as mastitis, or perhaps a large benign cyst that Democedes successfully lanced, drained, and sterilized.
Okay, that makes much more sense.
Herodotus took a deeply traumatic personal medical crisis and exaggerated the cure to serve his own narrative. He used her suffering as a convenient plot device to explain the origins of the Greco-Persian Wars.
It's infuriating to see a brilliant administrator reduced to a plot device. But it brings us perfectly to the core historiographical problem our sources highlight, because history didn't just give us one version of Atossa. Depending on who was writing, her identity fractured into what the sources call the four faces of Atossa.
And this is where we really see how a woman's legacy is digested by different cultures. If you research Atossa, you will encounter four distinct, often contradictory archetypes.
Let's break these down, starting with the one we know is true, the administrator. This is the face preserved in the Persepolis fortification tablets. This Atossa is financially autonomous, a logistical powerhouse, and an independent landowner.
Right.
She is grounded in the mundane reality of moving grain and paying workers.
She's the COO. But then you look at the Greek playwright Aeschylus, and you get the second face, the noble regent.
Okay, tell me about this one.
Aeschylus wrote a play called The Persians in 472 BC. It is the oldest surviving play in the history of theater, and he portrays Atossa with immense dignity and tragedy. In his narrative, her son Xerxes has suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Greeks.
Right.
Aeschylus writes Atossa as the majestic moral compass of the empire, the anxious mother who has to bear the crushing weight of imperial failure when the men ruin everything.
So Aeschylus gives her this tragic, regal anxiety, but then Herodotus gives us the third face, the manipulator. We just discussed this. This is the cynical view where her power is rooted entirely in the bedroom, secretly driving foreign policy through whispered demands.
And finally, as you move into modern literature, you encounter the fourth face, the femme fatale. Writers like Nikolaj Ulyanov transform her into an almost mystical figure. In this portrayal, she is characterized by dark hubris. She becomes the unapproachable phantom, the shadow queen pulling the strings from the darkness, almost akin to a witch.
So history looks at this incredibly complex woman, and because they can't reconcile her various roles, they split her into caricatures. The boss, the tragic mother, the manipulator, and the witch. When you look at those four faces, what stands out to you?
Well,
Because to me, it feels like a coping mechanism for historians who just couldn't compute a woman this competent. They couldn't understand someone who held divine legitimacy, survived 3 brutal regime changes, invented constitutional law, and managed the empire's agriculture. It broke their categories.
that is a phenomenal observation.
Right.
Every culture projects its own anxieties onto her. The Greeks needed to explain why the massive Persian war machine was attacking them, so they made her a manipulator. Later writers wanted a compelling villain, so they made her a mystical phantom. But as historians, we have to constantly return to the primary evidence. We have to return to the clay.
The receipts don't lie, and if we look past the poetry and the gossip, we can finally see the true architecture of the power she built. Our sources define this as her architecture of soft power, and they visualize it as a synthesis of 3 core elements.
Think of it as a structural triad. First, she possessed divine legitimacy. She was the Zoroastrian Atossa, the living vessel of the caverna. She provided the theological anchor that justified the empire's existence to its people.
Second, she possessed strategic intellect. She wasn't just a passive symbol, she actively deployed the born in the purple constitutional maneuver to navigate the deadliest transition of power in the ancient world, crowning her son without sparking a civil war.
And third, she possessed economic autonomy. She commanded independent logistics and agricultural wealth, proven by the Persepolis tablets. She didn't rely on the king's treasury, she controlled her own node in the supply chain.
When you combine divine right, strategic genius, and independent wealth, you get the true kingmaker. The Persian kings wielded absolute hard power, they commanded the vast armies and ordered the massive monuments built, but Atossa completely monopolized the soft power.
She really did.
She didn't just survive the deadly politics of the Achaemenid court, she literally engineered the foundation it stood on.
Which is why her final chapter is so profound. Because unlike almost every male ruler we have discussed today, Atossa's story does not end on a battlefield or with a poisoned goblet.
The unwritten end. She achieved her ultimate strategic goal. She successfully outlived Darius, who died in 486 BC. And more importantly, she lived to see her master plan realized. Xerxes took the throne smoothly. Her constitutional logic held firm. The empire did not fracture.
Having secured the dynasty, she simply fades from the historical record around 475 BC. We do not have a specific date or cause of death, but considering she was born around 550 BC, she lived to the exceptional age of roughly 75 years old.
Living to 75 in the ancient world is an achievement in itself. Doing it while surviving 3 hostile royal transitions, endless court intrigue, and a severe medical crisis is staggering.
It is incredibly rare. She almost certainly succumbed to natural causes. And in a dynasty,
Do we know where she is buried? Is there a massive monument?
her specific tomb remains unidentified, though scholars strongly believe she rests near Darius at the royal necropolis of Nakashi Rostam. But the lack of a specific named monument is entirely fitting for her.
Exactly. The ultimate Shadow Queen doesn't need a theatrical death scene, and she doesn't need a giant stone pyramid to scream her name into the void. She just quietly exits the stage after ensuring the entire geopolitical theater is running exactly how she designed it. She did the work, she secured the future, and she stepped away.
She proved that ultimate power isn't about holding the sword. It is about controlling the grain that feeds the man holding the sword.
And that is the exact perspective shift we want you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive. The next time you are reading a history book or even analyzing modern geopolitical power structures, look past the grand, sweeping narratives. Look past the loud speeches and the men demanding their names be carved into the walls.
Look for the logistics.
Exactly. Look for the logistics. Look for the soft power. Look for the people quietly managing the supply chains, inventing the legal loopholes, and stamping the receipts behind the scenes. Because that is where the real architecture of power lives.
It really is.
We want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the profound final quote from our source material today. The quote states, "History remembers the men who carved their names into stone, but the Achaemenid Empire only stood because Atossa engineered the mortar."
That's a great quote.
Think about the implications of that for a moment. If the true architects of human history are the ones managing the agricultural estates, authorizing the travel rations, and quietly rewriting the constitutional laws in the background, whose stories are we completely missing today simply because we're too busy looking up at the monuments instead of looking down and reading the receipts? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you've been taught. We'll see you next time.